The day you dare to ask without lowering your gaze, without justifying yourself, without shrinking away. That day not only does your true life begin, it also marks the end of all those versions of yourself that settled for less. In this audiobook, you will discover that knowing how to ask is not a social technique or an act of good manners. It is a way to tell the world who you are and what you are willing to accept. We will talk about what nobody taught you, how desire, boundaries, money, relationships, and your mental well-being are deeply tied to your capacity to open your mouth without fear. This is not an audiobook for those who remain silent out of habit. It is for those who are ready to stop waiting and start claiming their place. Chapter 1. Why do you always wait for permission? There is a scene that repeats itself more often than it should. You, standing there, with words stuck in your throat, feeling that you want something, that you need it, that it belongs to you, but you don't ask. You don't move. You don't claim it. You just wait. You wait for someone at some moment, with some gesture, with some sign to tell you, you may. And that, although you don't say it out loud, you have done so many times that it has become part of you. You don't question it. You don't see it as strange, because that is how you were taught, because that is how you were molded, because somewhere in your childhood, you learned that asking for permission was synonymous with respect, that raising your hand was rudeness, that if you stepped forward, you were selfish, that if you raised your voice, you were a problem. But what nobody told you, what nobody explained with brutal honesty, is that there comes a point at which continuing to ask for permission is another way of surrendering, of postponing what you know you deserve, of handing over to others a power that should never have left your hands. The permission you are waiting for will never arrive. Not because the world is cruel, but because no one can authorize your life in your place. No one is going to step into your story and say, "It's time for you to be you." That doesn't happen, because while you await validation, the world goes on, moves forward, decides for you, runs right over you. And the cruelest part is that when you finally dare, when you stand up, when you say what you think, when you do what you desire, then the very same people who used to demand permission from you look at you with discomfort, because you are no longer functional, because you no longer adapt, because now you bother, because you have become someone who no longer needs their blessing just to breathe. Do you see the absurdity? You spend half your life seeking approval, and the other half feeling guilty when you stop needing it. There is no freedom without conflict. There is no growth without rupture. And that means, in practice, that you will have to learn to live without applause, without hearing you're doing the right thing. Because if you are going to do something big with your life, you are going to unsettle many. Those who prefer you quiet, those who benefit from your docility, those who count on you always saying yes after asking, "May I?" Now tell me, how many times in recent years have you stopped simply because you didn't receive the green light? How many times did you have the idea, the impulse, the clarity, and you waited for a sign, a message, a smile that would authorize you? And it didn't happen. It never came. Because it wasn't necessary for it to come. Because the only thing you had to do was trust yourself. But of course, that also scares you. Because when you stop asking permission, you no longer have anyone to blame if you make a mistake. Because if you decide for yourself, if you take the plunge, if you act, you can't say, "It's just that nobody allowed me." Now it's you. Your will, your decision, your responsibility, and that, although it liberates, also weighs. Many prefer to continue waiting for instructions, because instructions bring comfort, because following orders seems safer, because making mistakes on your own seems more serious than failing while obeying. But the cost of that comfort is brutal, because every time you decide not to decide, you dilute yourself. You disappear. You disconnect from the strength within you, the strength that doesn't shout, but that knows, the strength that doesn't need permission, only decision. Look around you. The people who have achieved real things are not those who waited for the perfect moment. They are the ones who created it. They are not the ones who asked permission. They are the ones who dared. They are the ones who got tired of waiting for the world to treat them fairly and went to build their own justice. That too you can do, but not if you keep waiting for someone to tell you that it is the moment. Because no one will. Because it does not suit anyone that you wake up. Because as long as you keep asking for permission, you remain manageable. And the manageable is useful, but never free. Start with small things. Speak up when you have something to say. Move when you feel it is your time. Don't over-explain. Don't over-justify. You don't need a reason that sounds good. It is enough that you truly feel it. And if someone gets upset, let them get upset, because you did not come into the world to be comfortable for others. And if you have spent years in that silent prison, do not punish yourself. Do not blame yourself for having been obedient, prudent, diplomatic. You did what you could with what you had. But now you have more. You have awareness. You have experience. You have hunger for another life. And that is already reason enough to move. So I'm not telling you to be reckless, impulsive, or aggressive. It is not about trampling over others. It is about no longer lowering your head when what is due is to raise it. It is about saying, this is what I want. This is what I think. This is what I need, without asking forgiveness for existing. You will lose things along the way. People who do not understand your change. Spaces where you no longer fit. Places where your new voice sounds too loud. Fine, let them go. Let them close. You cannot live your own life if you keep playing to please. And if there is a wound behind your need for approval, do not ignore it. Observe it. Embrace its origin. But do not marry it. Because what happened to you cannot continue to dictate who you are today. You are no longer that child who was told they had to behave well to be loved. You are no longer that teenager who felt they only mattered if they did not bother. Now you are someone who no longer needs the door to be opened for them. Because you can knock it down if necessary. Freedom is not begged, it is assumed. And you are already ready. No more permission. Now it's your turn. Chapter 2. Asking at work. Are they paying you what you're worth? There is no environment in which your ability to ask is tested more than at work. There, in that space where you put in effort, where you invest time, ideas, energy, and sometimes even your health, it becomes most evident whether you dare or not to defend your value. And what hurts is not only the salary that doesn't arrive. What really weighs is the feeling of contributing far more than what you receive, of fulfilling beyond what is required, of stretching your limits every day, and that none of it is seen, recognized, or compensated. Some people get used to it. They adapt. They resign themselves with phrases like, "At least I have a job," or "It is what it is in this sector." And so the years go by. What was once a temporary solution becomes a permanent sentence. The fear of losing the little one has become stronger than the desire to reach what one deserves. But you know it. You feel it every time you see another colleague earning more while doing less. Every time a new boss promises you things that never materialize. Every time you swallow hard and smile when you ought to be saying, "Enough already." And the worst part is that the system knows this. It is designed so that you do not ask, so that you are grateful to be inside, even if they exploit you, so that you do not make waves, so that you do not compare, so that you do not question. Because if you do not speak, if you do not ask, if you do not claim, the game works in their favor. And you have to pay the bill in silence, with endless workdays, with multiplying responsibilities, with that exhaustion you feel when you know you give too much for too little return. But asking at work is not only a matter of money. It also has to do with respect, with time, with growth, with dignity. Because there are those who earn well and still feel mistreated. Because the problem is not always what comes into your account at the end of the month, but what they take from you while you earn it. Your voice, your judgment, your self-esteem, your right to say no. And here is where everything crosses over. Because to ask at work, you first have to believe it outside of it. You have to understand that your time is not cheap, that your effort has a price, that you are not being difficult for wanting fair compensation, and that you are not disloyal for setting boundaries. Asking for a raise is not betraying the company. It is stopping betraying yourself. Asking for better conditions is not being problematic. It is acknowledging that what you give deserves an environment worthy of it. Of course, there are ways. Of course, there are moments. It is not about pounding on the table or dramatizing, but it is about choosing when to speak and doing it with firmness, with data, with clarity, with confidence, and above all, without fear of having the door slammed in your face, because if that is the price for saying what you're worth, then that place no longer deserved your presence. Perhaps you have been telling yourself for years that it is not the right moment, that it will come eventually, that it is better to wait for them to propose it to you. But let me tell you something that maybe nobody has told you. If you do not bring it up in conversation, it may never happen. There are bosses who will never offer it, not because you are bad, not because they do not value you, but because as long as you do not ask, they can keep taking advantage of your silence. So do the inner work. Make a realistic list of what you give, of your results, of your achievements, of the times you took on more than what was expected of you without asking for anything in return. And then decide if it is time to speak up. And if you do not do it in fear. Do not wear a face of apology. Do not prepare excuses in case they say no. Just bring your facts and your presence. And if that is not enough for them, maybe you should start to wonder if they are enough for you. Because staying in a place where your value is not recognized, just out of fear of not finding another, is also a form of surrender. And of course, it is terrifying. But sustained complacency wears you down more than any uncertainty. Because it is one thing to be patient and another to live numb. It is one thing to wait for the moment and another to stay waiting all your life. The world has changed. Today there are more opportunities than ever for those who dare to look. And though it is not easy, though it is not immediate, it is better to move toward a place where they value you than to remain paralyzed in one that drains you. And don't get me wrong, I am not telling you to quit tomorrow. I am not saying that you should demand without thinking about consequences. I am saying that you should listen to yourself. Take yourself seriously. Look honestly at what you are giving and compare it with what you are receiving. If that balance is broken, don't keep telling yourself that everything is fine. Talking about money remains taboo for many, as if asking for more made you ambitious, ungrateful, or greedy. But money does not only pay your bills. It also reflects how you see yourself, how you believe others see you. And if you have been working, growing, contributing for years, do you really think it is wrong to say, "I want more"? Asking for what you're worth does not make you less noble. It makes you freer. And if the place where you are doesn't understand that, the problem is not you. The problem is a system that prefers submissive employees over fulfilled people. So start rewriting the script. Stop staying silent about what makes others uncomfortable just out of fear of losing what no longer fulfills you. The real loss is shrinking inside while pretending to be grateful on the outside. The next time you think about asking, don't see it as a threat. See it as an act of truth, an act of maturity. An act that says, I know what I am worth, and I'm not going to keep giving it away. That is already much more than many dare to do. Chapter 3. The hidden language of those who don't know how to ask. There are people who never ask directly, yet live asking all the time. Not with clear words, not with straightforward sentences, but with a twisted language, disguised, loaded with silences, with hints, with insinuations that never fully state what they really want. And the most paradoxical thing is that many times they don't even do it maliciously. They do it because they don't know any other way, because they learned that expressing what you need as you feel it is dangerous, invasive, something that provokes rejection. So they begin to live communicating halfway, sending signals, hoping that others guess, intuit, understand what they do not dare to say out loud. And of course, that rarely works, because the other person has no obligation to read between the lines, nor to interpret gestures, nor to decipher what you yourself don't know how to pronounce. But that doesn't stop you from continuing to wait, from continuing to be disappointed, from accumulating frustration that doesn't stem from the response you didn't get, but from the request you never made clearly. The hidden language of someone who doesn't know how to ask is full of traps. It is a web of vague phrases, of hints disguised as casual comments, of prolonged silences aiming to provoke a reaction. People who don't say, I need you, yet expect you to be there. People who don't say, I don't like this, yet withdraw hoping you understand. People who don't say, I want this, yet get offended when you don't give it to them. And all of that wears you down. Not only the one who practices it, but also those around them. Not knowing how to ask does not make you a victim. It often makes you someone hard to be with, because the confusion you generate makes others feel that no matter what they do, they always fail, because they are not responding to a clear need, but trying to fulfill invisible, shifting, undeclared expectations. And that has an origin. Nobody is born afraid to ask. Nobody arrives in the world feeling like a burden. That is learned. It is absorbed from a young age. Sometimes because when you asked, you were yelled at, or ignored, or told you were being picky, that you were annoying again. So your brain did the only thing it could to survive. It learned to stay silent, to observe, to wait, to desire without saying it, to need without showing it. And of course, that pattern does not turn off when you grow up. It becomes automatic. It becomes your habitual way of relating. And when adulthood arrives, the environment is no longer as hostile as before, but you continue to act as if it were. You keep waiting for others to step forward, for them to realize, to take the initiative. And when they don't, you interpret it as disinterest, as lack of love, as rejection. But the problem is not that they don't love you. The problem is that you give them no tools to show it. You give them a puzzle without showing the image it should form. Knowing how to ask requires courage, not just because it exposes you, but because it forces you to do something that scares you. Be specific. Say what you need, how you need it, when you need it. And that is terrifying, because if you say it and don't receive it, there is no room for interpretation. You can no longer hide behind, maybe they didn't understand. You can no longer hide in ambiguity. Knowing how to ask is a way of putting your cards on the table, and that hurts when you have spent years playing emotional hide and seek. But it is worth it. Because when you learn to express yourself truly, relationships change. They stop being a battle of assumptions and become a space where both parties can build something real. Asking clearly not only allows you to receive, it also gives the other person the chance to respond from a sincere place, to choose if they want to be there, to know exactly what is expected of them. And this not only applies to romantic relationships, it also happens in friendship, with family, at work. People who say, do whatever you want, but get angry if you don't do exactly what they expected. People who smile while something hurts them inside. who pretend everything is fine because they don't know how to say that it isn't. And then they accumulate anger, and then they explode, and those around them are left without understanding what happened. Breaking away from that hidden language is a process. It does not happen overnight, because at first you will feel that asking makes you brittle, that it exposes you, that it puts you in a vulnerable position. But the truth is that asking clearly is an act of power, because only those who feel worthy ask, those who know they have a right to be heard, those who are no longer willing to be invisible or to settle for what is left over. If you recognize that pattern of communicating halfway in yourself, do not judge yourself. Do not blame yourself. Observe. Learn to recognize when you are waiting for someone to guess what you need, when you are disguising your desire as a casual comment, when you are using sarcasm as a shield. And each time you notice it, ask yourself, what would happen if I said it exactly as I feel? You do not have to shout. You do not have to impose. It is enough that you say it, with words that do not hide, with sentences that need no translator. And if the other does not respond as you hope, at least you will know that you were clear, that you gave them the opportunity, that you did not remain in the shadows waiting for someone to turn on the light. Asking is not only a practical matter. It is a way of being in the world, of saying, this is who I am, this is what I need, this is what I expect. And doing it does not make you weak. It makes you visible. It makes you real. Because no one can accompany you if they do not know where you are. Because no one can give you what you need if you do not express it. Leaving behind the hidden language is a process of relearning, of reclaiming your voice, of stopping playing guess who I am, and starting to show yourself just as you are, with what you want, with what you feel, with what you need. Even if your voice trembles, even if you do not always receive what you ask for. Because the alternative, pretending nothing is happening, is a slow, silent way of disappearing. And you are not here for that. You are here to express yourself, to connect, to live with the peace of knowing that what you carry inside is not rotting in silence, but becoming word, act, shared life. Chapter 4. You don't ask, because you don't want to inconvenience. You have learned to step into the background with a skill that is frightening. You do it naturally, almost without realizing it. You know exactly when to swallow what you need, how to stay silent without it showing, how to get out of the way so that no one feels bad. You don't ask, not because you don't need it, but because you fear what might happen if you do. You fear the reaction, the twisted look, the change in tone, the you again. You don't ask, because you don't want to inconvenience. They taught you to measure your words carefully, not to raise your voice at the table, to think before speaking, not to bother. And that, which seemed like good manners, ended up being a shackle. Because now, every time you feel the urge to express something, the first thing you do is evaluate the impact it will have on others. If they will like it, if they will understand it, if it will not provoke tension, if it will not spoil the moment. And while you worry about all that, you keep disappearing. You step back a little more. You sharpen the skill of pretending that everything is fine, even if it is not. Even if inside you something is demanding to come out. Even if what you hold inside is burning you. There is a type of person that everyone recognizes as the one who never bothers, the one who adapts, the one who says don't worry, the one who puts on a good face, the one who never asks for a big favor, the one who waits until there is a leftover and only then asks if they can take a bit. And from the outside, it seems admirable. It seems that they need nothing, that they are always fine. But that is not maturity. That is disguised exhaustion. And what happens with that role is that it becomes a prison. Because the longer you stay being that person, the harder it is to get out without it seeming like a drastic change. People get used to you not asking. They get used to you always giving in. They rely on that. And then, when one day you dare to say, "This doesn't sit right with me. This bothers me. This hurts," others do not understand. They get offended. They accuse you of having changed. But the truth is that you did not change. You just began to say what you used to swallow. And that makes them uncomfortable, because it forces them to see you in a different way. You don't want to inconvenience, but you live uncomfortable. You don't want to be a burden, but every day what you carry feels heavier. You don't want to create conflict, but the conflict lives inside you, with you, like a conversation that never ends, that never resolves because you always postpone what you feel. And this is not new. It has come from afar, from when you understood that speaking clearly had consequences, that expressing what hurt you was not well received, that asking for something could become a problem. So you began storing it away, once, again, and yet again, until it became a habit, until you no longer even noticed that you were doing it. Now think about it. How many times have you said, "It's okay," when in reality it wasn't? How many times have you said, "Whatever you want," when you perfectly knew what you wanted? How many times have you smiled on the outside while inside you longed to be somewhere else? Not asking to avoid inconvenience is a form of renunciation. Renouncing your right to exist with everything you are, with your needs, with your opinions, with your emotions. And the problem with that renunciation is not only what you don't receive, but who you become in holding on to it. Because you stop being you to become an acceptable version, a harmless version, a version that doesn't bother, but also a version that doesn't feel alive. And there comes a point when the body gets tired, because there is a limit to everything. Because when you do not allow yourself to inconvenience outwardly, your discomfort erupts inwardly. In the form of insomnia, anxiety, constant fatigue, the feeling that life goes by and you are not fully in it. Inconveniencing is not hurting. It is not imposing. It is not trampling. Inconveniencing is simply having presence, having weight, having a voice. And sure, there will be those who will not tolerate it, because it is more comfortable for them if you remain as you are. But you cannot continue reducing yourself not to bother. Look around you. Observe those you admire, people who inspire respect, who have boundaries, who know how to say no. Do you think they got there always being the easy person? No. They got there because they dared to occupy their space, because they knew how to inconvenience with elegance, because they understood that you cannot build a dignified life treating everyone else well. So yes, there will be times when asking for what you need causes tension. Maybe someone will make a sour face. Maybe they will call you selfish. Maybe they will not react well. And that does not mean you are doing something wrong. It means that you are breaking out of the mold they put you in, that you are changing the rules of the game, that you are making it clear you are no longer willing to live just to avoid disrupting others' emotional climate. It is not your responsibility that everyone be comfortable with your truth. Your responsibility is not to betray it, not to keep asking forgiveness for having needs, not to keep minimizing yourself to be accepted. Because when you learn to ask, even though that may inconvenience, you realize that the world does not end. That sometimes, on the contrary, it opens up. Because there are people who were waiting to see you like that, to see you real, to see you human, to see you authentic. And others who will simply disappear, because they were there only as long as you were functional, quiet, useful, kind. And that, too, is a blessing. Knowing who yes, who no, who never again. Each time you choose not to inconvenience, you are deciding to live partially. You are accepting that the other be comfortable while you break inside. And that, in time, leaves wounds. The kind you can't see but that mark you. Wounds of silence, of invisibility, of kindness misunderstood. So give it a try. Once. On a small scale. Say what you need. Ask for what is yours. Be direct, clear, calm. Don't dress it up. Don't soften it until it loses meaning. Just say it. And observe. Observe how you feel. Observe what happens afterward. And above all, observe how your way of being in the world changes when you understand that asking, even if it inconveniences, is a form of respect for yourself. Because if you do not allow yourself to inconvenience, you will end up resenting yourself. And that is much harder to repair. Chapter 5. Asking for love. What nobody taught you. Since childhood, we were filled with phrases about love. That love is given. That love is earned. That love arrives only if you are good, if you behave, if you do not bother too much. We were taught to beg for affection with forced smiles, to earn attention with performance, with effort, with sacrifice. But nobody told us that asking for love was valid, that you could need it and say so, that it was okay to raise your voice to say, I am feeling lonely and I need you close. What they taught us was something else. They taught us to stay silent, to interpret the other's absences as normal, to justify the other's coldness as lack of time, as pressure, as temperament, to tolerate unbalanced relationships just so as not to seem weak. And over the years, we perfected the art of not asking for love. We became experts at disguising the need, at masking it with pride, locking it behind sarcasm, distracting ourselves with tasks, goals, and activities so we wouldn't have to confront that uncomfortable sensation of giving a lot and receiving little. And the worst thing is not receiving love. The worst thing is not knowing if you can ask for it without feeling guilty, without seeming demanding, without feeling like you're breaking some invisible rule that says true love is not asked for, that it is simply given. But that is a lie. Love is asked for. It is asked for with words, with actions, with presence, with boundaries. Because there are moments in life where loving in silence is not enough. Where you cannot keep waiting for the other to understand your emptiness, intuit your wounds, or decipher your veiled gestures. Asking for love is not a weakness. It is a form of emotional honesty. And yes, it involves exposing yourself. Because when you ask, you reveal that there is a need. And that can be scary. Fear of seeming fragile, fear of not being reciprocated, fear that the other is not willing to give you what you need. But not asking out of fear of not receiving is living with the certainty of remaining empty. Because silence has never filled a heart. It numbs it, it acclimates it, it cools it, but it never fills it. There are those who boast of needing no one. People who say they expect nothing from others, that they are fine alone, that they can handle themselves. And maybe they believe it. Maybe they can even sustain it for a time. But that is not freedom. It is resignation. Because human beings need connections. They need contact. They need to feel seen, valued, loved. Denying it is not maturity. It is a form of protection. A defense learned after too many disappointments. And here comes something that almost never gets said. Asking for love does not make you less strong. It makes you more human. It makes you someone who no longer wants to act as if nothing is happening when inside something very much is. It makes you someone who, instead of settling for emotional crumbs, decides to express that they need more, that they deserve more, and that they are willing to say it, even if that shakes the comfort of the other. But of course, not everyone is prepared for that. Not everyone knows how to receive a request for love. There are those who get frightened, who feel accused, who get uncomfortable because they are demanded a level of presence for which they are not ready. And that is where many clashes occur. You ask from vulnerability, the other listens from defense, and communication breaks down. That is why how you ask is so important. Not from reproach, not from demand, not from blackmail. Asking for love is not saying do it or else. It is opening up, showing yourself, allowing the other to enter that space where you have nothing left over. But neither do you lack dignity. It is saying, this is me when I am not pretending to be strong. This is me when I am not hiding. And then, if the other responds from that same place, something powerful happens, a real connection, a response without fear. But if they don't, you still have the right not to stick around. Because the love you have to beg for, the love that is always half given, the love that leaves you with the feeling of apologizing for needing, that is not healthy love. That is a bond that only endures because you keep silent about what you really want to shout. And here is an uncomfortable truth. Asking for love from someone who does not want to give it hurts. The rejection hurts. The indifference hurts. That evasive answer that leaves everything up in the air hurts. But even so, that honest wound is preferable to living in eternal doubt, waiting for a change that never comes, enduring an absence that is never named, surviving in a relationship where everything is taken for granted, except you. There comes a moment when asking for love becomes a vital decision, because it is no longer only about the other person. It is about you, about how you relate to yourself, about how much you believe you are worth, about whether you continue tolerating drip-by-drip affection or decide at last to demand a connection that does you good, that nourishes you, that sustains you without conditions that make you lose yourself. And if it is hard for you to ask for love, ask yourself, since when? From where? To whom was the first time you did not dare to say, I miss you? Maybe it was with your parents, with a first love, with someone who didn't know how to see you. But that is past now. You are no longer there. You do not have to stay with what is. Now you can choose. You can ask. And if they don't give it to you, you can leave. Because staying where you are not loved as you need is not bravery. It is self-abandonment. Asking for love, then, is not the end of a relationship. Sometimes, it is the beginning. The first step to start building something more honest. Something where you don't have to pretend. Where nothing has to be guessed. Where you, too, are a priority. But for that, you first have to say it. Dare. Put a name to what you have been feeling in silence for so long. And yes, there may be tremors. Your voice may crack. It may not come out perfect. But what matters is not how you say it, but that you say it. Because love is not always obvious. It is not always automatic. Sometimes it needs reminders. Sometimes it needs to be claimed. And you have the right to do so. Not because you are desperate, not because you are weak, but because you finally understood that what is not asked with the heart ends up being begged with a wound. And you are no longer here for that. Chapter 6. What you ask reflects where you are in your life. Asking is not just an act, it is a mirror. Every time you open your mouth to express what you want, you are revealing much more than a single isolated desire. You are showing, without realizing it, the emotional place from which you are living, the level of clarity you have about yourself, your relationship with deserving, your way of seeing the world. Because not everyone asks for the same things, nor in the same manner, nor with the same background. And it's no coincidence. There are people who ask for small things, almost as if they struggle to exist. Folks who, before speaking, are already downplaying the request, subtracting weight from it, diminishing its importance. if it's not too much trouble. Whenever you can. Don't worry if it isn't possible. Those phrases aren't courtesy. They are anticipatory resignations. They are disguised ways of not taking up space, of making it clear that they do not want to inconvenience anyone, of asking without seeming to be asking, as if that would make their need more acceptable. And then there are those who ask for too much, not because they know precisely what they want, but because they have a void they don't know how to fill. People who demand affection, attention, recognition, validation, all at once, without pause, without filter. They aren't asking for something concrete. They're asking for someone to hold them from within, to put them back together, to save them. And that no matter how much they disguise it, is also noticeable. Because someone who asks from lack does it with anxiety, with desperation, with the sense that if they don't receive what they expect, everything will collapse. And then there are those who ask with clarity, with calmness, with firmness. People who know what they are looking for, who have done the inner work necessary to differentiate desire from need, impulse from conviction. They do not ask on impulse or from a need to control. They ask because they have learned to identify what does them good, and they allow themselves to have it. They ask with respect, but without fear, with confidence but without arrogance, because they don't have to shout to be heard, nor shrink to be accepted. Each of those ways of asking speaks of a different life stage. It speaks of the journey already traveled, of the wounds that have not yet healed, of the lessons already integrated or still painful. There is no better or worse way. There are ways that reflect what phase you're in, and whether you are truly prepared to sustain what you ask for. Because that is the key point. It is not enough merely to desire something. You must be ready for what it implies to have it. And that does not always happen. Sometimes life does not give you what you ask for, not because you don't deserve it, but because you're not ready to receive it. Because asking for mature love demands having left behind relationships that only fed your ego. Because asking for professional freedom requires that you be willing to assume the responsibility it involves. Because asking for peace implies that you renounce certain conflicts that, deep down, you keep fueling simply because they've become familiar to you. What you ask for says much more about you than you imagine. And I'm not only talking about what you ask of others, but also what you ask of yourself. There are those who demand perfection, constant performance, unceasing productivity. They wake up each morning with an endless list of obligations, with no space to listen to themselves, no margin for making mistakes. And that, too, is a way of asking. Asking yourself not to allow yourself to be human, not to pause, not to feel. Because they feel that if they stop, if they let go, if they show vulnerability, everything will fall apart. Others, on the contrary, have begun to ask themselves for something else. Time, silence, space. They have understood that there is no medal at the end of a life lived without pause, without tenderness, without care. They have begun to ask themselves for less demand and more presence, less expectation and more reality. And that only happens when you stop chasing an idealized image of yourself and begin connecting with who you really are, at the exact point where you are. And that is the key to this entire chapter. Knowing how to look at what you are asking for as a compass. Not to judge yourself, but to understand yourself. To recognize whether you are asking from fear or from fullness. From urgency or from trust. From the impulse that something must change, or from the certainty that you have already changed. Because it is not the same to ask for company simply so you don't feel alone, as to seek it because you want to share who you are. It is not the same to ask for a job out of need as to do so because you know you have something valuable to contribute. The way you phrase your desires reflects the level of connection you have with yourself. And of course, this does not mean that you must always be in your best version in order to ask. Sometimes asking from fragility is the most honest thing you can do. The important thing is not from where you do it, but that you are aware of it. That you don't deceive yourself. That you don't confuse lack with authentic desire. That you don't believe that because you ask for something very big, you are already prepared to sustain it. Because sometimes one asks for a healthy relationship when they don't even allow themselves to have an honest conversation. They ask for freedom while remaining trapped in old patterns. They ask for calm while still fueling the chaos. That is why it is so powerful to pause and observe. Not to stop yourself, not to limit yourself, but to adjust your gaze, to align what you want with what you are truly willing to live. Because asking for something you cannot sustain creates frustration. And that frustration, over time, makes you doubt yourself, makes you feel unworthy, makes you feel useless, makes you feel that nothing works. When in reality, the only thing that failed was the timing, or the form, or the place from which you made that request. The work, then, is not only asking, it is doing the inner journey so that what you ask for has roots, so that it is not just a phrase thrown into the air, but a decision born of your truth. And that is a skill to train, to refine, to develop over time, with stumbles and with successes. It is not about demanding perfection of yourself when you ask. It is about being increasingly honest, more clear, more coherent. Because asking with awareness is a way of life, a way to stop improvising your destiny and begin writing it with intention. And when you reach that point, what you ask for ceases to be a plea and becomes a declaration of who you are, of what you have lived, of what you are ready to sustain. And that, in the end, changes your way of being in the world. Because when you know how to ask from the right place, you also know when to stay silent, when to wait, and when to let go. And that is no longer coincidence. That is evolution. Chapter 7. Asking and receiving are not the same. Asking is an act that demands courage, but receiving, truly receiving, with body, mind, and dignity intact, is an entirely different task. Because one thing is to desire something strongly and say it out loud, and quite another is to hold what arrives when that desire is fulfilled. And that is where many people stumble without understanding why. They believe that the universe does not hear them, that life gives them only half measures, or that luck is against them, when in reality what happens is that they are not prepared to receive what they have been asking for. Some have been asking for love for years, but when someone finally arrives who offers it in a clean, generous, present way, they feel uneasy. They begin to erect barriers, to suspect, to question whether it is real, to think there must be a catch, because in their inner world, love has always been synonymous with effort, with trial, with a constant struggle to deserve it. And when love does not hurt, when it does not demand absurd sacrifices, they don't know what to do with it. Not because they don't want it, but because they do not recognize it as their own. Some ask for success, opportunities, visibility, but when those things actually appear, they self-sabotage. They minimize themselves. They hide. They feel they are not up to the task, that they have no right, that they will disappoint. Because they became accustomed to living in lack, in waiting, in the narrative that everything costs more than it's worth. And so, when life finally answers, when something good knocks on their door, they look at it with mistrust. They overanalyze it. And instead of opening their arms, they take a step back. And it's not that they don't want it. It's because they don't know how to exist in that space. Because no one taught them that you also have to train yourself to receive, to hold what arrives, to take care of it, to integrate it, to make it part of your story without feeling that you're occupying a place that does not belong to you. Asking is the first step. It is the conscious act of naming a need. But receiving is an emotionally much more complex process. It implies breaking old internal pacts. It implies letting go of believing that good things only happen to others. It implies looking clearly at the possibility that you too deserve. And that is not always easy. Because guilt appears. Because the old inner voice that says, "This is too much for you," speaks louder. Because, as contradictory as it seems, the familiar, even if it is painful, sometimes feels more comfortable than the new. Receiving demands presence. It demands genuine availability. And that means you cannot be asking for something while internally you keep rejecting what it represents. You cannot ask for freedom if, deep down, you're terrified of making decisions on your own. You cannot ask for abundance if each time someone gives you something valuable, you feel you owe them forever. You cannot ask for peace if you are not able to coexist with yourself without noise. The act of receiving is an exercise in self-esteem. It is looking in the mirror and saying, "Yes, this is also for me." Without excuses, without discounts, without justifications. You don't have to give it back instantly. You don't have to compensate for it. You don't have to hide your joy for fear that it will bother others. Receiving is allowing yourself to enjoy, to inhabit what arrives, to assume that what you asked for is here and that it's time to live it, without fear of losing it, without the weight of emotional debt. But there is also another side. There are those who believe they are asking, but in reality, they are only declaring. They make lists, visualizations, promises, but they do not truly open themselves to the possibility that it might materialize. Because if it did materialize, their life would have to change. And that change terrifies them. So they stay in the theory. Because asking without truly involving themselves is easier. Because as long as they only desire and nothing arrives, they can keep feeding the idea that one day everything will be different. But when it does arrive, there are no more excuses. You can no longer say that life didn't give it to you. Now it is your responsibility to hold what you have invoked. And holding it requires growth. It requires maturing. It requires taking charge. You asked for a healthy relationship. Now you must learn to communicate without games. You asked for professional recognition. Now you must hold that role with responsibility. You asked for inner peace. Now you have to review your habits, your thoughts, your circles. What arrives not only brings answers, but also poses challenges. Because everything you receive changes your internal map. It forces you to reconfigure yourself, to rewrite your own narrative, to accept that you are no longer the person who was waiting. Now you are someone who is living what you once desired. And that is why there is so much fear. Because it is easier to stay asking than to accept that the moment has come to act from a different place. Because receiving not only transforms your environment, it also transforms you. And that, even if it is desired, can hurt. It can unsettle. It can stir parts of you that were asleep. Receiving is not passive. It is not staying still while the universe blesses you. It is an act as active as asking. It requires awareness. It requires unlearning. It requires knowing how to let go of the past without guilt. Because what you asked for does not fit into the old version of yourself. It needs space. It needs a new mindset. It needs a body that is willing. And here is where everything becomes real. When you understand that it is not enough to know what you want, you must be ready to live it, to take care of it, to allow yourself to enjoy it without feeling that something bad will happen just because finally something good is happening to you. So before you keep asking, ask yourself if you are truly prepared to receive. If your life, as it is today, can sustain what you are seeking. If your mind can accept that you are worthy of it. If your body can relax and receive without tension. If your heart can open without asking for guarantees. Because sometimes, the true work is not in manifesting. It is in not sabotaging what you have already achieved, in not ruining it out of fear, in not pulling away just when it becomes real. Because when the good arrives, it doesn't always announce itself. It simply shows up. And then, only then, it is up to you to decide whether you hide or whether you allow yourself to stay. Chapter 8. When you ask from lack, no one hears you. There is a way of asking that sounds but does not resonate, that is heard but does not make an impact, that is expressed but does not sink in. It is the kind of request born from emptiness, from fear, from the sense that you are worthless if you do not receive an immediate answer. It is the voice that trembles more from desperation than from truth. And no matter how loudly you cry out, no matter how many tears fall, no matter how many words you use, it does not arrive. It does not move others. Because when you ask from lack, from that sense of emotional urgency that demands someone come to fix you, what you project is not a legitimate need, but an implosion that the other person does not know how to handle. And it is not because others do not care. It is because there is something in the energy of that request that exhausts. Because when you are not asking for something specific, but you instead cast your anguish disguised as need, the message becomes distorted. The other person does not know how to help you, because what you are saying is not what you truly need. And that creates disconnection. You tell yourself that no one understands you, that no one responds, that no one takes care of you. But what really happens is that you are communicating from a place where you yourself feel broken, and you expect someone else to come and give you meaning. The problem with asking from lack is that you turn the other into a savior. You ask them to look at you, to affirm you, to make you feel valid. You are not seeking an act. You are waiting for redemption. And that, no matter how much the other tries, will never be enough, because there are no external words that fill the internal void that one has not learned to sustain on their own. We have all been there at some point, in that stage where love is begged for, where recognition is demanded as if it were a debt, where affection seems like a prize you have to earn. And in that dynamic, asking ceases to be a conscious gesture and becomes an emotional urgency. You no longer ask with clarity. You clamor. You plead. You send smoke signals hoping someone deciphers them. And of course, when they do not, you become frustrated. You feel that no one cares for you, that the world is indifferent, that your voice has no value. But what really happens is that you are asking from a place that does not connect. Because what is received is not only what is said, but the place from which it is said. And when the place from which you ask is fear of abandonment, guilt, self-pity, or resentment, the message is tainted. It becomes a burden, not a conversation. Sometimes you have to stop before asking and ask yourself just one question. Am I asking for something specific, or am I looking for someone to rescue me? Because if what you're seeking is to be fixed, you will end up disappointed. No one can give you what you deny yourself. No one can be the permanent refuge for your instability. And most importantly, no one can hear you if what you do is launch your need like an emotional bomb. That is not to say you cannot experience moments of fragility. Of course you can. Everybody does. But there is a huge difference between asking from honesty and asking from an unhealed wound. Asking from honesty is recognizing that you are tired, that you need help, that something is overwhelming you, and doing so without manipulation, without disguise, without pressure. Simply showing up. Asking from a wound, on the other hand, is dumping all your anxiety onto the other person and expecting them to bear it, to translate it, to solve it. And that is why, many times, someone who asks from lack feels they are always ignored. Because what they convey is not a request, but a constant emotional overflow. The other person does not respond because they don't know where to start, because they don't see the boundary, because they feel that whatever they do will not be enough. So they step away. And you confirm your theory, no one cares for me. But that is not true. What happens is that when you do not know how to hold yourself, the other does not know how to approach you. Because the place from which you ask does not allow true connections. It only demands attention. And attention without real connection does not nourish. It merely soothes the symptom, but it does not heal the root. So, what do you do with this? How do you break out of it? The first step is to learn to listen to yourself before speaking. To stop for a moment and ask, am I asking for something real? Or am I looking for someone to save me? Because when you do that exercise with honesty, you realize how many times you were not asking for something specific, but simply seeking momentary relief from pain. And that's okay. No one expects you to have perfect emotional control, but if you do not do that prior work, what you project is chaos, and chaos is not embraced, it is avoided. The other does not leave because they do not love you. They leave because they don't know how to care for you without disappearing in the attempt. Learning to ask from fullness does not mean you are okay all the time. It means you have learned to view your needs with maturity, that you no longer beg to survive, that you no longer shout to exist, that you can ask without falling apart when you don't get what you expect, and that you know, even without a response, you still have value. The key lies in ceasing to seek in others what you haven't cultivated within yourself. If you want to be heard, listen first to what you are transmitting. If you want to be cared for, tend to the way you present yourself. If you want your requests to carry weight, start speaking them to yourself with clarity, without drama, without disguise, without emotional blackmail. Because when you ask from a place of calm, the other person perceives it, not as a burden, but as an invitation. And then a gesture appears, a response appears, a presence appears. Because you are not hurling your lack as a demand. You are sharing a need from a place of respect. And that, as subtle as it may seem, changes everything. Asking from lack is not a crime, but neither is it a strategy that works. You can do it once, twice, 3 times, but in the end, the only thing you achieve is reinforcing your own emptiness. The day you learn to ask from the certainty that your worth does not depend on what others give you, your words will begin to carry different weight, and your life a different course. Chapter 9. Why is it harder for you to ask than to give? Throughout your life you have learned to give, to offer yourself, to care, to be there for others even when you yourself are not entirely okay. You have turned that gesture into part of your identity. You give time, you give attention, you give support, you give your energy even when you are exhausted. And you do it with such naturalness that it impresses, almost as if it were the most logical thing in the world. But when it comes to the other side, when it's time to ask, to show that you need something, to open the door and let someone enter to help you, you freeze. You overthink it. You turn it over and over in your mind. You find 1,000 ways not to do it, and it's not because you lack needs. Of course you have them, like everyone. What happens is that you have been taught that asking means exposing yourself, that it means showing you can't handle everything on your own, that it places you in a vulnerable spot. And even though your mind might try to tell you that asking is normal, that everyone does it, that there's nothing wrong with it, your body recoils, it contracts. Something inside you experiences it as danger, and you don't always know why. Giving makes you feel strong. It gives you a role. It places you in a position of control. When you give, you decide. You manage the situation. You move within familiar terrain. But when you ask, something changes. Now you depend on the other's response. You put yourself in an open, uncertain position where you cannot predict what will happen. And that, if you have spent a long time holding others up to avoid looking at your own voids, can be unbearable. Moreover, there is something deeper. In many cases, giving has become your way of feeling useful, of validating your place in relationships. You believe that if you are always available, if you anticipate everyone's needs, if you don't inconvenience anyone, and you solve whatever arises, you will be loved. You will be needed. You will be chosen. Because deep down, you associate love with utility, affection with sacrifice, presence with performance. And of course, when you have to ask, all that balance is disturbed. Because now you are not giving anything in return. You are only showing what you lack. And it's hard for you to believe that someone will stay with you in that state. That is why you avoid asking. You disguise your requests. You turn them into suggestions, into silences, into gestures that hope to be interpreted. You wait for someone to notice without your having to say it. Because if you say it, you feel you will lose something, that the other person will look at you differently, that you will no longer be as valuable. You don't think that in explicit words, but you feel it, and that feeling weighs more. Ironically, many of the people who give the most are those who most need to receive. But they have learned to contain it, to postpone it, to pour themselves outward so as not to deal with what goes on inside. It is a sophisticated mechanism. Giving becomes a way not to ask, an emotional strategy to avoid feeling vulnerable. Because as long as you give, no one questions you. No one sees you as fragile. No one accuses you of needing. And so you go through life with a broken scale, holding relationships in which you always contribute and rarely claim something in return. Relating from a place where balance does not exist, but where the appearance of strength is maintained, until one day you collapse. Because giving without asking wears you out. Because nobody can live only from giving. Because your body starts to scream it when you can no longer silence it. Learning to ask when you have spent your life giving everything is not easy. It will feel uncomfortable, forced, sometimes even unfair. But it is necessary. Because if you don't learn to ask, what you give ends up tainted. It is no longer giving. It is the need for acceptance. It is a covert hope that someone, one day, will notice everything you do and give it back to you without your having to ask. But that rarely happens. And when it does not, the disappointment is enormous. And it turns into resentment, into accumulated pain, into the feeling of being surrounded but alone. And this is where it's necessary to pause. Because it's not about stopping giving. It's about including yourself too. About recognizing that your need does not subtract from your value. That asking for something does not invalidate everything you have given to others. That being strong does not mean being self-sufficient all the time. That true strength also lies in knowing when to open your hand to receive. And yes, it is likely that it will be difficult at first. That your voice will tremble. That you will feel you are doing something wrong. But little by little, if you sustain it, if you practice it, if you surround yourself with people capable of hearing you without demanding performance from you, it will stop hurting. You will discover that there is another way to be in the world. One in which you don't have to earn affection through favors. One in which you can ask without feeling less, without feeling like you are breaking something. And that is where true reciprocity begins. When you give because you want to, not because you need to secure your place. When you receive without guilt, without debt, without having to immediately compensate. When you learn to say, "Today I can't," without feeling that you are failing. When you understand that giving and asking are not opposites, but parts of the same healthy bond. That balance is not about tallying favors, but about allowing affection to flow in both directions. So if asking is harder for you than giving, observe yourself without judgment. Look at your history. Look at your emotional loyalties. Look at how long you have believed that you are only worth something when you solve others' problems, and begin to wonder what would happen if, just once, you stopped holding everything together and allowed yourself to be the one leaning on someone else. The one who needs, the one who asks, the one who ceases doing in order, simply to let yourself be cared for. And if you don't know where to start, begin with something small. A gesture, a phrase, "Could you help me with this?" request. You don't have to let go of everything at once. Just allow yourself, little by little, to step out of the role that protected you for years and begin inhabiting a version of yourself that is more real, more human, more complete. Because you did not come into this life only to give. You are here too, to receive. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you will truly feel accompanied. Chapter 10. Asking for time, asking for rest, asking for peace. Asking for time seems like a simple, almost trivial act. But there is something about that request that deeply unsettles. Because we live in a society that glorifies speed, that rewards a full calendar, that applauds the person who is always available, who never stops, who shows up even when they can't go on. And in that constant noise, asking for a moment's pause, asking for space, asking for silence, is seen as a luxury, as a rarity, sometimes even as a weakness, as if stopping were surrendering, as if resting were wasting time, as if peace were a whim that one can only afford once everything else is done. But asking for time is not evasion. It is holding yourself. It is choosing not to burn out just to fit in. It is recognizing that the body is not a machine, that the mind needs gaps in order to restore itself, that the soul does not blossom amid a perpetual state of alarm. And still, it is hard. Really hard. Because by asking for time, you break with a collective expectation. You say not now, and that is sometimes read as laziness, as lack of commitment, as selfishness. Because we have been programmed to associate value with productivity, presence with immediate response, affection with unmeasured availability. And so you get used to not asking for it. You adjust. You squeeze yourself. You stretch beyond what is reasonable. You tell yourself you'll have a moment for yourself later, when this is over, when that is resolved, when everything is calmer. But that moment never arrives, because there is always something else. A new urgency, a commitment you cannot postpone, someone else's expectation that you feel you cannot disappoint. And you go on adding days on autopilot, with the sense that time is slipping away even as you keep running, without stopping for a second to ask yourself where you are heading. Asking for rest is no easier, because to rest is to stop. And stopping means facing what the noise used to cover up: emptiness, accumulated exhaustion, the questions you have been avoiding. Resting is more than sleeping or taking a day off. It is allowing yourself to not do, to not perform, to not hold everything together. It is saying, today I can't, without guilt. Today I stay with myself, without having to justify it. And that, for those who have lived under the mandate of always being available, sounds almost transgressive. There are people who feel more comfortable exhausted than at peace. Because when they rest, their mind fills with voices. Because in the silence emerges the sadness they did not speak, the anguish masked by busyness, the loneliness hidden beneath tasks. That is why they avoid stopping. Because rest is not just physical, it is also emotional. And sometimes, the emotional aspect is more frightening than exhaustion. Because exhaustion at least is known. But rest demands a certain surrender, a relinquishing of control, and trusting that even if you are not doing something useful, you are still valuable. And then there is peace. That word that sounds so simple, so desirable, but that is rarely asked for out loud. Because how does one ask for peace without it sounding exaggerated? How do you explain that all you desire is to not be pressured, not to be yelled at, not to be expected to provide a version of yourself that you can no longer sustain? How do you tell the people you love that you don't need more advice or more errands or more activities, but simply a little peace? Peace is not a landscape. It is a decision. It is a boundary you place to protect what you are rebuilding inside. And sometimes it implies stepping away, turning off your phone, not answering that message, canceling that plan, leaving something read that you used to feel you had to reply to immediately. And that creates noise, because those around you, accustomed to your constant presence, react. They ask if you are okay, if something is wrong, if you are upset. But no, nothing is wrong. You're simply trying to find yourself again, to hear yourself again. And for that, you need silence. Not just the absence of external noise, but an internal calm. Asking for peace is asking for respect for your process. It is telling the other that your way of healing doesn't always look like a smile or a desire to talk. Sometimes it looks like an afternoon spent doing nothing, like choosing not to have a conversation, like allowing an emotion to arise without having to explain it. And that too is part of self-love, knowing how to say, "Today I do not want noise," without feeling that you are letting anyone down. But to be able to ask for time, rest, or peace, you first have to believe you deserve them. And that is the hardest part. Because for years you were made to feel that stopping is failing. That if you are not tired, you are not doing enough. That if you are not available, you are being selfish. That if you do not keep pace with everyone else, you are falling behind. And breaking free from that is painful. It is like deprogramming yourself. It is looking at your life with new eyes and realizing how many times you said yes just to avoid disappointing someone. How many commitments you accepted when all you really needed was an afternoon of peace with yourself. Asking for time is reclaiming your rhythm. Asking for rest is giving your body the place it never had. Asking for peace is choosing your mental health over your reputation. And that, even if it is uncomfortable, is urgent. Because if you don't do it, no one will do it for you. No one is going to tell you, "Enough already. Sit down, breathe, disconnect." Because the world does not stop. You are the one who has to decide when to pause. And of course, some will not understand. There will be those who drift away. There will be those who call you distant, cold, strange. But they are not seeing what's beneath. They are not seeing that you are not distancing yourself from them. You are drawing closer to yourself. You are beginning to hear your own voice. You are ceasing to live on autopilot. You are choosing a way of being in the world that does not consume you from within. And that, even if it bothers others, is necessary. So start with something simple, by saying you need a day without plans, by turning off notifications, by refusing to justify your fatigue, by sitting and looking out a window without doing anything productive. And observe what happens. In your body, in your mind, in your emotions. Because many times, what we need most is not someone to rescue us, but permission to stop running, to stop pretending, to stop fulfilling everything. And when you dare to ask for that, time, rest, peace, with the same firmness you once used to ask for opportunity or affection, something in your life begins to shift. Not in a spectacular way, nor with fireworks. It changes in the subtle, in the profound, in the invisible. Because you start treating yourself as someone who also deserves to be well. And that, even if it doesn't seem so, changes everything. Chapter 11. How to ask without seeming aggressive or weak. One of the greatest challenges when asking for something is finding the right tone. knowing how to say what we need without seeming like we're imposing, nor like we're begging. Finding that exact point where our words neither wound nor crawl, where the request arises from firmness rather than anxiety, but also not from an ego that demands. And that, although it sounds simple, is an art that very few master. For a long time, we were taught that anyone who asks for too much is invasive, that anyone who demands is selfish, that anyone who complains is a problem. And at the other extreme, that anyone who expresses a need too softly risks appearing weak, someone not to be taken seriously. And so, trapped between those two extremes, many people choose to remain silent, to say nothing, to resign themselves, to convince themselves that it's better not to inconvenience others than to make a mistake in how they ask. But living with a closed mouth, out of fear of not knowing how to speak, is a silent sentence. Because what is left unsaid does not vanish. It accumulates. It infects. It turns into resentment, distance, discomfort. And then, when it finally bursts out, it can no longer be handled with maturity. It is no longer a request. It is a scream. It is an explosion that takes with it what perhaps could have been resolved with a timely conversation. To ask without seeming aggressive or weak involves something deeper than choosing the right words. It involves knowing from where you are speaking, what emotion lies behind your request, which part of you is taking the microphone. Because it is not the same to speak from clarity as to speak from a wound. It is not equal to ask for something with the confidence of someone who knows what they deserve, as it is to ask with the tremor of someone who believes they are begging for a favor. And that is where everything begins to change. When you decide to review not only what you say, but also the emotional place from which you say it. Because that, more than any well-constructed sentence, is what the other person perceives. It is what is transmitted. It is what makes an impact. Asking well does not mean disguising your need, nor does it mean softening it so much that your message is lost. Asking well is speaking with respect, but without apologizing for existing. It is expressing a need without turning it into a threat or a supplication. And that requires practice. It requires presence. It requires having listened to yourself beforehand so that you know with clarity what you need, why you need it, and what you are willing to do if you do not get it. Many times, what generates rejection is not the content of what we ask for, but the energy with which we ask. If you do it from reproach, the other person will close off. If you do it from extreme weakness, the other person won't know how to support you. But if you do it from the serenity of someone who is not demanding a debt, but opening a possibility for dialogue, everything changes. Because the other person does not feel attacked, overloaded, or obligated. They feel invited, and that is where a genuine response can appear. Now then, there is an important point. You cannot control how the other person will react. Even if you ask with clarity, with respect, with firmness, the other may not be ready to listen. They might go on the defensive. They might minimize what you are saying. They might feel singled out, and that is not your fault. You are responsible for what you say, how you say it, and from where you say it. But you cannot be responsible for the other person's unresolved emotions. That is why, before opening your mouth, it is necessary to do an honesty check. Ask yourself what you are truly seeking with that request. Are you trying to resolve something? Do you need understanding? Are you setting a boundary? Or are you simply trying to make the other person change without assuming any responsibility yourself? Because if you do not have that clear, the conversation becomes tangled. The other person senses that there is something more beneath the surface, even if it is not named. And that blocks any possibility for authentic connection. Knowing how to ask also means learning to handle a no without collapsing. Because if you can only stay calm when the answer is yes, then you are not asking. You are demanding. And a demand, even if it is disguised as cordiality, always carries a tone of threat. It always bears an emotional weight that the other person perceives as a trap. By contrast, When you ask knowing that the response might be no, yet you still choose to express yourself, that has immense power, because it shows that you are not subjugating your peace to what the other does, that you are saying what you feel without conditioning the relationship, that you are being authentic, not manipulative. And that kind of dialogue does not always get you what you want, but it does gain you something more valuable: respect. Because respect is not begged. It is built in how we relate to others and to ourselves. So, how do you ask without seeming aggressive or weak? You ask from clarity, from connection with yourself, from the will to preserve the bond, but without betraying yourself in the process. You ask knowing that asking is neither imposing nor resigning. It is simply opening a space for the need to exist, for it to be heard, for if the other is available, a response to be given, and if not, then a decision to be made. Because in the end, knowing how to ask is also knowing how to decide, knowing when it is worth insisting and when it is better to step back, knowing when to continue conversing and when to accept that not everyone is ready to relate to someone who no longer accommodates any kind of bond. And that, even if it hurts, is part of the process. Asking does not make you weak. It makes you human. And if you ask from a healthy place, it does not make you aggressive. It only makes you real. And sometimes, being real is the most uncomfortable thing you can be for others, but also the most necessary thing you can be for yourself. Chapter 12. Asking the Universe. Mysticism, energy, or autosuggestion. At some point we have all done it. Alone, in a low voice, with hands clasped or eyes closed, looking at the sky or at nothing at all. In the middle of a difficult night or on the brink of a significant change, we speak to something that has no face, that does not respond with words, that does not sign with ink. We ask the universe. We don't really know how it works or if it even works, but we do it. Because there is a part of us that needs to believe that there is something beyond the visible. Something that listens, that organizes, that returns. And it doesn't matter if you call it the universe, God, energy, the quantum field, or deep intuition. Each person names it as they can, as they learned, as it makes sense to them. What matters is not the name. It is the act. The moment when you stop controlling and begin to trust. The exact instant when you let go of the need to understand everything and simply say, "This is what I want. This is what I need. This is what I am willing to receive." But asking the universe is not magic. It is not closing your eyes and hoping things will somehow fall into place on their own. It is not lighting a candle and then forgetting the rest. It is an internal, intimate practice that touches fibers deeper than logic. Because what you are actually doing is not only asking for something external, but also aligning yourself with a possibility. And that changes how you think, how you look, how you act. It changes your posture. It changes your emotional frequency. It takes you out of the silent victim mode and puts you into a state of openness. And that is where many people get confused. Because they think that asking the universe means sitting back and waiting. That it's enough to visualize, repeat affirmations, or write in a journal for things to arrive. But that is only one part of the process. The other part, the most important, is what you do afterward. Because the universe, if it exists as a responsive force, does not act over you. It acts with you, through you. When you ask from a genuine place, something inside you begins to move. You do not know how, but you start making different decisions. You begin to notice signals that you previously overlooked. You feel doors opening, and others closing without guilt. Not because everything is preordained, but because your attention starts to focus differently. You are no longer in survival mode. You are in creation mode. And that is powerful. Because asking the universe is also a way of listening to yourself with profundity, of filtering what you truly desire from what you only believed you should want, of inserting a pause between impulse and reaction so that you can ask yourself from which place you are requesting this. Because if you ask for something to fill a void, the universe, life, your unconscious, whatever, will return more emptiness. But if you ask from the awareness that you are already whole, that what you seek is an expansion and not a repair, then everything gains meaning. Some people dismiss these kinds of practices because they seem naive, esoteric, or irrational to them. But the point is not whether the universe listens or not. The point is what changes in you when you stop for a moment to formulate a desire with intention, with presence, with direction. Because that simple act already places you somewhere different. It takes you out of complaint mode and puts you into choice mode. You are no longer reacting to the world. You are creating a conversation with it. And here another element comes into play: autosuggestion, which is nothing more than the power your thoughts, your words, and your emotions have over your own biology, your decisions, over the way you perceive your surroundings. When you repeat an idea, your body records it, your brain assimilates it, your actions start to align, even if you are not aware of it. And that is where your reality begins to change. Asking the universe does not mean that every single thing you say out loud will be fulfilled exactly as spoken. But it does mean that your energy will begin to generate a different field. That you will attract things, not from superstition, but from resonance. You will produce an internal state that favors certain relationships, certain decisions, certain movements. And that itself is a way of manifesting. Now then, it is also true that we do not always receive what we ask for, or not in the moment we want, or not in the way we imagine. Sometimes what arrives is not what you expected, but rather what you needed to grow, to correct your course, to let go of something you did not realize was holding you back. And that also belongs to the process, because asking is not demanding, it is trusting. And trusting implies accepting that not everything will happen as you planned. That is why when you ask, do it with intention, yes, but also with humility, with openness, with the willingness to accept that sometimes what you want is not what is best for you. And that, if you learn to look with different eyes, you may find that what arrives is even better than what you asked for. Because you are growing. Because you are no longer asking from whim or anxiety, but from the maturity of someone who knows that life is not forced, it is accompanied. And if it is hard for you to believe in all this, that is okay. You do not have to fully understand it. Just experiment. Pause for a moment. Listen to what you need at this point in your life, what you long for, what you are ready to receive, and then say it. Write it down. Launch it out there. Not like someone who tosses a coin into a wishing well, but like someone who commits to a new version of themselves, like someone who declares a path, not just before the universe, but before their own life. Because asking the universe, in the end, is not speaking to a distant force. It is reminding yourself that you too are part of something bigger, that you are not alone, that there are threads you do not see, but that move when you do, and that sometimes, just sometimes, it is enough to dare to ask for everything to begin, very slowly, to fall into place. Chapter 13. When no one gives you what you asked for, there comes a moment in life that hurts more than one would like to admit. That instant when, after summoning your courage, after sorting out what you feel, after daring to speak, nothing happens. No one responds the way you expected. No one moves. No one approaches. No one gives you what you asked for. And you remain there, with your words already spoken, your vulnerability exposed, with the sense that you took a step forward only to meet the void. And of course you knew it could happen. Deep down, you knew that not everyone understands, that not everyone listens, that not everyone is available. But that does not lessen the blow. Because when you truly ask for something, you are not just expressing a sentence. You are opening a part of yourself. You are revealing what you need, what matters to you, what touches you inside. And when on the other side, there is no echo, no gesture, no response, the silence becomes a brutal mirror. The first thing that happens is confusion. That feeling of not knowing whether you did something wrong, whether you said it in the wrong way, whether the timing was not appropriate, whether you should have kept quiet. And then your mind goes into a loop. It replays the scene. It analyzes it. It questions it. And you begin to build the idea that asking was a mistake, that you should have held on a bit longer, that perhaps you did not deserve it as much as you thought. But that is not true. The other person's silence does not invalidate your request. Indifference does not erase your need. The absence of a response does not turn your truth into an exaggeration. It simply reveals a limit, a lack, an inability or a choice. That the other person is unwilling or unable to give you what you asked for says nothing about your worth. It says something about their own limits. And although that hurts, it is also information. Because not knowing what place you occupy hurts more than having it clarified, however uncomfortable that may be. The most dangerous thing in these moments is that they can cause you to shut down, to become harder, more cautious, more silent. You can start thinking that it's better not to ask, that it's better not to show yourself, that it's better to pretend you are fine, and that, over time, distances you from yourself. It turns you into someone functional, yes, but disconnected. Because the one who stops asking for fear of not being heard also stops feeling alive. And here is where a turning point must occur. Because when no one gives you what you asked for, life forces you to look elsewhere, to consider whether you were asking of someone who could never give, to ask yourself whether you were placing your need in a place where there was never room for you. And sometimes, the answer is yes. Sometimes you have begged with such intensity of someone who never knew how to love you in a healthy way, that when you finally asked for something, there was no one left on the other side. Only your projection, a desire that had no anchor. And then it hurts, of course. But it is also freeing. Because when you see with clarity that what you so greatly hoped for is not going to arrive, you can stop waiting. And that is more powerful than any positive affirmation. Because it returns your sovereignty. It lets you decide what you do with the part of yourself that still believes you need what never came. Perhaps the hardest part is not the lack of a response, but what you do afterward. How you handle that blank space. Whether you carry it with you as a wound that seeps into every new bond. Whether you transform it into resentment or cynicism. Or whether you decide to turn it into a quiet confirmation that this was not the place. That if someone does not give you what you asked for, even though you said it from love, with respect, with clarity, then that person cannot accompany you at the stage where you are. And that does not make the other person a villain, nor you a victim. It simply locates each of you in your rightful place. Because there are bonds that only work as long as you do not request too much, as long as you accommodate yourself, as long as you do not cause discomfort. But the moment you say, "This is what I need," everything wavers. And that reaction is more revealing than any promise, because it shows you if there is space for you. Not for the version that is pleasing, but for you, in full, with your needs, with your silences, with your difficult moments. The brave thing is not to keep asking where there is no answer. The brave thing is to accept the lack without interpreting it as failure. The brave thing is to not close your heart, even if they have ignored what cost you the most to say. Because that is not something they can take away from you. The act of asking, of showing yourself, of choosing yourself, remains yours. And that, even if the other does not value it, leaves you at peace with yourself. Now, I am not telling you it doesn't hurt, nor that you must get over it in 2 days. I am only saying that there are pains which at first seem like punishments, but which over time reveal themselves as doors. Doors you never thought you would cross, that you did not want to, that you did not seek, but that lead you to another place. Sometimes even to another version of yourself. A version that no longer begs for love, that no longer insists where it has understood it does not belong, that does not punish itself for having needs, that does not settle for relationships just for the sake of company. A version that asks, yes, but that also knows when to stop asking. Because it has understood that asking is not debasing oneself, and that not receiving is not always rejection. Sometimes it is redirection. Sometimes it is the beginning of a more sincere conversation with yourself. So when no one gives you what you asked for, allow yourself to feel it. Without drama, without a mask. Acknowledge it. Cry if you need to. Name it, and then move on. Not out of pride, not to prove anything to anyone, but because your life is too valuable to live it in the waiting room of those who do not know how to receive you. Because even when you are not given what you asked for, you still have the right and the responsibility to give yourself what you need, even if you must learn to do so from scratch, even if it is more difficult, even if it hurts. Asking is an act of self-love. That you are not given what you asked for does not turn it into a mistake. It turns it into a sign. One that, if you know how to read it, can mark the beginning of a much more honest path. With yourself, with the world, with what is to come. Chapter 14. Asking forgiveness and being forgiven. There is something profoundly human in the act of asking for forgiveness. It is not simply pronouncing a word. It is not a formula, nor a gesture to get by. Asking for forgiveness, when done truly, is opening a wound. It is acknowledging that something you said, something you did, or something you failed to do caused harm. It is looking the other person in the eyes and saying, I know, I see it, and I do not want you to carry it alone. But we weren't taught to do it well. We were taught to apologize quickly, to say it almost as a formality, as a final dot that closes a conflict so life can go on. We got used to using it as a lifeline in arguments that already made us uncomfortable without stopping to feel what it really meant. And on the other side, we also learned to respond with, it's okay, even when it wasn't, even though something inside was breaking. Asking for forgiveness implies a form of humility that many find unbearable, because it means admitting you were wrong, that you were clumsy, that you fell short, that you failed. And that, for someone who built their value on the idea of being impeccable, untouchable, or always strong, can feel unbearable. That is why some people ask for forgiveness through tightly pressed lips, without looking you in the eye, without inhabiting what they say. And then there are those who simply do not do it, because they believe that asking for forgiveness places them in a position of weakness, when in reality, it is one of the most powerful acts there is. Asking for forgiveness is stopping the world for a second and saying, I know my actions had consequences, and I take responsibility. It is renouncing justifications, mental shortcuts, excuses, not to self-flagellate, not to humiliate yourself, but to make clear that the other person matters, that their pain matters, that what happened was not insignificant, that you do not want that to remain there, throbbing in silence, generating distance, eroding something that perhaps still can be saved. But you also have to know how to ask, because it is not enough to say, I'm sorry, if you do so while expecting the other to calm down, to talk to you again, for everything to go back to how it was. Forgiveness is not a key that opens every door, nor a guarantee of reconciliation. Sometimes, even, asking for forgiveness does not change anything on the outside. The other person may not want to listen to you. They may not be ready. They may not be willing. And that, too, you must learn to respect. Because asking for forgiveness is a personal act. You do it for yourself, because you do not want to keep carrying what was unsaid, what was unacknowledged. Because you understand that something in you needs to take responsibility. But you cannot force anyone to give you what they are not yet able to. You cannot make forgiveness a transaction. I say this, and you give me that in return. That is not how it works. Asking for forgiveness is letting go of control over the outcome. It is showing vulnerability without any guarantee of what will happen next. And of course, there is the other side. Asking for forgiveness and being forgiven. Because there, another quality is at play. The other person's capacity to release, to open, to transform pain into something else. Forgiving, when done truly, is an act of courage. Not because it implies forgetting, because there are things that cannot be forgotten, but because it implies choosing not to continue living from that wound. And that requires emotional maturity. It requires recognizing that the other person was wrong, yes, but that you choose not to keep living from that place. When someone asks you for forgiveness from the heart, a silence unfolds, a real one that has nothing to do with words, but with what is felt in the air. There is a tension that eases, a door that opens. Sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes you cannot, you don't know. You're not willing to forgive. And that too is okay. Forgiveness cannot be an obligation. It must be a decision. One that arises when you no longer want to live chained to what hurt you. And if you decide to grant it, do so for yourself. Not because the other person deserves it, not because they asked in the best possible way, but because you no longer want to carry the weight of that story. Because you understand that staying in resentment binds you, consumes you, drags you down. It does not mean that what happened is okay. It does not mean you will allow it to happen again. It means you choose to free that space so you can move forward. Asking for forgiveness and forgiving are two sides of the same coin. The coin of emotional repair. They do not always meet. They do not always coincide. There are times when one asks and the other is not ready, or the other forgives silently and you were not even aware you had hurt them. But when they do meet, when they look at each other face to face, when someone says, "I am sorry," and the other answers, "I know, and it's okay," something is restored. It is not magic. It does not erase everything, but it creates a before and an after. Because at that moment there is no longer a battle. There is no longer a struggle of pride. There remains only a desire to heal. And that desire, if it is honest, can rebuild bonds that seemed lost. But even if there is no reconciliation, if forgiveness is neither given nor received, asking for it, saying it, is still necessary. Because you don't do it just for the other person. You do it for yourself. For that part of you that knows it made a mistake and does not want to hide it. For the part of you that does not want that story to remain open without having been named. So when you feel you have hurt someone, do not wait. Do not hesitate. Don't make forgiveness a tactical move. Say what you need to say. From the heart. Without drama. Without adornment. Without demands. And if someone comes to you with an apology in their hands, listen. Even if you cannot give it back in that moment, listen. Because that listening astonishingly enough, already begins to close a wound. Asking for forgiveness and being forgiven is no guarantee of anything, but sometimes it is the first step toward a more genuine, more mature, more human form of love. One where there is no need to pretend that everything is fine, where you can talk about what hurts, where making a mistake is not the end. It's just part of the journey. Chapter 15. Asking for justice without losing your mind. There is a very thin line between the desire for justice and the need for vengeance. And when you feel hurt, betrayed, or silenced, that line becomes almost invisible. You want the damage to be repaired, but you also want the other person to feel, if only for a second, the same pain you felt. You want an apology, yes, but you also want the other to suffer, to understand, to truly understand. And it is there, in precisely that moment, where what is just starts to become obscured and anger begins to overshadow reason. Asking for justice is not about yelling louder. It is not about becoming what hurt you. It is not about imposing your truth as if it were the only truth. It is about standing firm in the truth that belongs to you, without letting pain turn into poison. It is about speaking clearly, pointing out what was wrong, defending your boundaries, demanding respect, but without losing your mind, without letting emotion drag you to a place from which you cannot build, but only destroy. There are moments when the impulse is legitimate. You have tolerated too much. You have been silent for years. You have tried 1,000 times to speak calmly, and suddenly you reach your limit. You no longer want to explain. You no longer want empathy. You no longer want to understand. You only want justice to be served. And although that impulse is human, if you cannot channel it, it can harm you more than the wrong you already suffered. Because when you lose your mind in the name of justice, your message becomes diluted. You lose legitimacy. You are no longer the person who reports an injustice, but the one who shouts. You are no longer someone who defends their dignity, but someone who tramples whatever is in their path. And that does not build justice. It builds fear, guilt, resentment. Above all, it pulls you into a place where it is impossible to move forward without dragging others down. Asking for justice requires emotional intelligence. Not coldness, not indifference, not distance. Emotional intelligence. The ability to breathe before you speak. To think about what you want to achieve before you act. To not let your need to be recognized turn you into someone on a crusade against everyone. Because anger, when it becomes a way of life, poisons you. And although it may seem to give you strength, it really consumes you from within. There is a justice that is built from dignity, from the act of saying, "This was not fair. I will not accept this. This has consequences," but without the need to humiliate, to crush, to ridicule. Because if, in order to repair the harm, you need to destroy the other person, then what you are seeking is not justice. It is revenge. And revenge only perpetuates pain. It does not close it. It does not heal it. It does not transform it. It multiplies it. There is also something important that is often forgotten. Not everyone is willing to give you justice. There are people who will never acknowledge the harm they caused, who will never take responsibility, who will defend their version with nails and teeth, even if they know it is false. And if you stay waiting for that act of justice to come from the one who hurt you, you could remain frozen in the same place for years. You could keep replaying the same story again and again, waiting for a gesture, a word, a recognition that may never arrive. And that is where you have to decide what kind of justice you want. Whether the kind that depends on the other understanding what you went through, or the kind you build yourself by choosing not to remain trapped in that waiting. Because sometimes, asking for justice means stopping to ask for it in the wrong direction. It means looking forward and deciding that the way you live your life from now on will be your own form of repair. It is not about pretending it did not hurt. nor about letting it go without having healed. It is about understanding that there are battles that no longer make sense, that there are people who will never give you what you deserve, that there are wounds that do not close with apologies, but with decisions. Decisions you make about how you speak to yourself, about how you care for yourself, about who you allow close, about which versions of yourself you choose to honor. Asking for justice is also a social act. There are situations that cannot be resolved through introspection alone. There are injustices that require you to raise your voice, to set boundaries, to seek support. Not everything is healed in silence. Sometimes you have to confront systems that protect the aggressor, structures that render harm invisible, environments that blame the victim. And in those moments, more than ever, you need clarity, firmness, conviction, but also strategy. Because if you go out to fight with your heart exposed and unprotected, you can be hurt again. And this time, with your own weapons. That is why, before asking for justice, you should ask yourself, why are you doing it? What do you expect? What would make you feel at peace? Because if you do not have a clear answer, you could end up in an endless struggle, confusing shouting with healing, accusing with letting go, confronting with closure. And those are not the same things. Forgiveness is not always possible, nor is it always necessary. But justice, understood as balance, as repair, as an act of truth, yes, it is necessary. And you have the right to ask for it. You have the right to point out what was wrong. You have the right to say that something was unjust. What you do not have is the obligation to ruin your life chasing a recognition that may never come. So if you are at that point, if you feel you can no longer swallow it, if you know you need something to be made right, do it. Ask for justice. Say what you need to say. But do not lose your mind in the process. Do not lose your direction. Do not lose your essence. Because the most unjust thing you can do to yourself is let pain turn you into a version of yourself that no longer recognizes love, calm, or the possibility of trusting again. The justice you deserve begins within you, in how you choose to care for yourself after everything has broken, in how you decide to speak without having to shout, in how you face what hurts without making pain your identity. Because when you ask for justice without losing your mind, you not only claim what is yours, you also reclaim what they took from you, your capacity to decide how you want to live from now on. And that, even if the world does not acknowledge it, is the most silent and most powerful way to win. Chapter 16. The Art of Asking Without Speaking. Your presence also asks. Not everything we ask for is spoken with words. Sometimes what we need most shows up another way. In a look that lingers a little too long. In a silence so heavy it cannot be neutral. In a constricted gesture that no one notices. But you know it's there. Because there are moments when speaking costs more than staying quiet, and yet you are asking. Even if you don't say it, even if you don't verbalize it, even if you don't express it clearly, your presence emits signals that say, I need something. I expected more. I'm not okay. The body also speaks. Absence also communicates. The way you arrive somewhere, the way you sit, the way you greet. All of that is a form of asking, even if no one registers it right away. Your presence, when it's not at peace, cannot pretend. Even if you smile, even if you do everything correctly, even if you don't complain, something still sends a message. And anyone who truly knows you feels it. They sense it without needing a translation. Some people are experts at speaking without actually saying anything. They're there, they listen, they participate, but their energy is screaming inside. They've learned to disguise their needs so precisely that only a very trained eye or a very open heart can notice that something is wrong, because they don't ask with words. But they are asking all the same, And here is where something important happens. Often, it's not that the other person doesn't care, or that you don't matter to them. It's that they don't know how to read that language. Because no one taught us that we also ask in silence. That there are ways to say, "It hurts," without making a sound. That there are ways to ask for help which don't pass through discourse, but through how you show up, through how you move, through how you remain quiet, through how you're no longer the person you used to be. But that does not mean you should always stay silent. Because even though your presence speaks, you can't expect everyone to hear what you're too afraid to say. Asking without speaking can be powerful, yes, but it can also become a trap. You might fall into the expectation that the other person should just notice, that if they truly cared, they would realize. And when that doesn't happen, you become frustrated. You feel invisible, ignored. But it's not always the other person's fault. Sometimes you yourself have silenced what you feel to the point that you can't even fully recognize it. That is why balance is necessary. You must know that your presence communicates, that it can be a tool, but also accept that you cannot build deep relationships relying solely on what is implied. Not everyone has the sensitivity, the attention, or the emotional closeness to catch your unspoken messages. And that doesn't make them cold or selfish. It makes them people with different codes. And if you don't translate your signals, what you're asking for may vanish into thin air. The opposite can happen too. Some people don't ask for anything explicitly, but their presence demands too much. They don't say what they expect, yet the way they show up creates pressure, discomfort, tension. Because you can also impose in silence. You can also manipulate without words. And that is not asking. It is loading the other person with the responsibility to guess what you aren't willing to communicate clearly. Your presence can ask for many things: attention, affection, distance, care, space, validation. And it's okay that it does. Not everything has to be said in structured sentences. There are moments when simply being with someone, truly being with them, is already a request. It is already a way of saying, "Here I am, but I'm falling apart a bit." What matters is that you yourself know what you're asking for, even if you don't say it. Because if you don't know, if you're so disconnected from yourself that you only know something is wrong but not what, then you aren't asking. You're sending out diffuse signals you couldn't interpret either. And that wears you out, and others. Because maintaining relationships in which all the important things are left between the lines ends up causing brutal exhaustion. No matter how noble it may seem, no matter how romantic the idea sounds of, "You don't need to say anything, I understand you." The reality is that adult communication needs both words and gestures, deeds and intention, what is said and what is transmitted. Sometimes, asking without speaking is poetic. It's gazing at someone who knows you and seeing in their eyes that they understood, that they got it, that they came closer, that you didn't need to explain. But that doesn't always happen. And you can't live expecting others to have that sensitivity. Because asking without speaking is powerful when it comes from genuine connection. But it becomes dangerous when it arises from the fear of speaking. And that is when you have to ask yourself the key question. Why aren't you saying it? Is it because you trust that the other person already knows? Or because you fear their reaction if you do speak? Asking with presence is an art when it is accompanied by clear emotional awareness. When you know what you need. When you choose to remain silent, not because you cannot speak, but because you know silence can also be a tool. But if you use it to avoid conflict, to not inconvenience, to keep seeming strong, then you are not using your presence to ask. You are using your silence to hide. And no one can respond to what you're denying to yourself. That is why the path must be mixed. Learn to read what your body is asking for. Learn to observe your gestures, your energies, your ways of being. And then also learn to translate it. Sometimes with words, sometimes with actions, sometimes with, "I'm not sure what's happening, but I feel bad." It doesn't have to be perfectly clear in order to be expressed. What matters is that you do not lock it inside. Because your presence does ask, always, even when you think it doesn't. The question is whether you are willing to take responsibility for that, to hold what it generates, to accept whatever comes, and above all, to no longer expect the world to adapt to your language if you're not willing to share the dictionary. Asking without speaking can be beautiful, but it cannot be your only way of communicating, because you deserve more than half understood. You deserve that you first understand yourself, and that begins by observing how you are asking without realizing, and then deciding, consciously, whether you will continue to keep quiet about what your body is shouting, or if finally, you will allow yourself to speak with everything you are. Chapter 17. Stop asking for what no longer makes sense. There is an inevitable certain moment when you realize that what you have been asking for all these years, you no longer need, or it no longer exists, or it has stopped making sense, even if you keep asking for it out of habit, pride, or fear of admitting it's over. It's hard to reach that point. Not because you lack clarity, but because it hurts to accept that you've been asking for something that not only hasn't arrived, but maybe never would. And you know it. You've known it for a while, but it's difficult to let go of hope when it is the only thing that has sustained your steps for so long. Sometimes, what no longer makes sense isn't what you were asking for, but whom you were asking it of. You insisted that they change, that they understand, that they become like they used to be, that they appreciate you, that they stay, that at last they do what they promised. But they didn't. They don't. And they will not. Not because they can't or don't know how to, but because they don't want to, or because simply they were never meant to give you what you hoped for. And although it hurts, you have to accept it. Because continuing to ask for something that doesn't arrive does not make you perseverant. It makes you stuck, clinging to an illusion that no longer even serves you, that has become a weight, that drains your energy, your dignity, your peace. You cannot build a life by asking the same thing again and again of someone who responds with indifference, excuses, or silences that shout you are not being heard. That is not asking. It is begging. And there is no dignified way to live in a state of begging. The big problem is that we often confuse loyalty with insistence. We think that stopping asking is giving up, that closing the door is failing, that admitting it no longer makes sense is surrendering. But it is not. Sometimes the most powerful act of self-love is to let go, to release that conversation that will never happen, to release that opportunity that didn't come, to release that someday that exists only in your mind, to release that message that never arrived, that reaction that never came, that repair that will never be offered. Continuing to ask for what no longer makes sense is a way of refusing to grow, of keeping yourself small, of continuing to seek outside what you can no longer find there. Because life changes. People change too. And what once was fair, necessary, and coherent may now be absurd, damaging, or simply useless. But if you don't reassess, if you don't have the courage to ask yourself whether that desire still makes sense, or if you're just trapped in the habit of asking for it, you'll keep wasting your energy. And that is exhausting. There is a silent exhaustion that comes from insisting where there is no echo, from waiting for answers where there is no connection, from repeating the same internal pleas without realizing that you no longer even believe them. But you don't know what to do without them, because they have accompanied you so long they became part of your identity. I am the one who fights. I am the one who insists. I am the one who never gives up. And yes, such a narrative can be inspiring. but it can also be a trap. Because there is a kind of bravery that does not shine, that gets no applause, that is never publicly celebrated. It is the bravery of stopping asking, of closing that chapter, of no longer insisting, of accepting that it's not for you, and that, even though it may hurt, also frees you. Because when you see clearly that what you so desperately hoped for will not come, you can stop waiting. And that is stronger than any spontaneous affirmation, because it returns your sovereignty. It lets you decide what you do with that part of you that still thinks it needs what never arrived. Perhaps the hardest thing isn't the lack of an answer, but what you do afterward, how you manage that blank space, whether you carry it with you as a wound that bleeds into every new connection, whether you turn it into resentment or cynicism, or whether you decide to transform it into a quiet, inner confirmation that this was not the right place, that if someone cannot give you what you asked, even though you said it from love, with respect, and with clarity, then that someone cannot accompany you at the place where you stand now. And that does not make the other a villain, nor does it make you a victim. It simply places each of you where you belong, because there are bonds that only work as long as you don't ask for too much, as long as you accommodate, as long as you don't make them uncomfortable. But the moment you say, "This is what I need," everything wavers. And that reaction reveals more than any promise, because it shows you if there is space for you, not just for the version that fits, but for you, whole, with your needs, with your silences, with your difficult moments. True courage is not continuing to ask where there is no. True courage is accepting the lack without interpreting it as failure. True courage is not closing your heart, even if they ignored what cost you the most to say, because they can't take that away from you. The act of asking, of showing yourself, of choosing yourself, remains yours. And that, even if the other does not value it, gives you peace with yourself. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't hurt, nor that you should get over it in 2 days. I'm only saying that there are pains that at first feel like punishments, but that over time reveal themselves as doors. Doors you never thought you would cross. Doors you didn't want to cross. Doors you weren't seeking, but that led you to another place. Sometimes even to another version of yourself. A version that no longer begs for love, that no longer insists where they've understood they do not belong, that does not punish themselves for having needs, that does not settle into relationships just for the sake of company. A version that asks, yes, but that also knows when to stop asking, because it has understood that asking is not debasing oneself, and that not receiving is not always rejection. Sometimes it's redirection. Sometimes it is the beginning of a more honest conversation with yourself. So when no one gives you what you asked for, allow yourself to feel it. Without drama, without a mask. Acknowledge it. Cry if you need to. Name it. And then move on. Not out of pride, not to prove anything to anyone, but because your life is too valuable to live it in the waiting room of those who do not know how to receive you. Because even when you are not given what you asked for, you still have the right and the responsibility to give yourself what you need, even if you have to learn it from scratch, even if it's more difficult, even if it hurts. Asking is an act of self-love. That it is not given to you does not make it a mistake. It makes it a sign, one that, if you know how to read it, can mark the beginning of a much more honest path toward yourself, toward the world, toward what is to come. Chapter 18. Asking yourself, discipline, love, direction. There comes a stage in life when you understand, without anyone having to explain it, that it's no longer so much about what others can give you, but about what you are capable of demanding from yourself. Not from punishment, not from a forced sense of duty, or that old script that says you must suffer to deserve anything. It's about something deeper. being able to look at yourself squarely and ask yourself, with firmness, what you need to move forward. Asking for discipline is not about punishing yourself. It's about acknowledging yourself. It's about no longer negotiating with the part of you that always procrastinates, that always finds excuses, that always waits for the perfect moment to start. That perfect moment never comes. It never comes. And you know it. But you remain there, postponing your own commitments as if they don't matter, as if your promise to yourself holds less weight than any vow you make to anyone else. That has to change first. Discipline does not begin with a calendar or a to-do list. It begins when you decide you will no longer continue treating yourself as a secondary option. Because you see it. You see how tired you get of waiting for results when you haven't even allowed yourself to maintain a habit for more than 3 days. You see how you get angry with yourself for feeling lost, yet you don't spend 5 minutes planning your week. You see how you fill your head with ideas, yet you leave no room to carry out a single one. It's not that you lack ability. You lack decision. You lack that uncomfortable self-conversation in which you demand, out of love, not out of a whip, that you either do it or you don't, because you no longer want to keep betraying yourself, because you can't keep simply surviving, because you know that if you don't take yourself seriously, no one else will. And that is where love comes in. But not the Instagram-worthy love, real love. The kind that leads you to set boundaries with yourself. The kind that won't let you continue accepting less than you know you deserve. The kind that does not allow you to stay surrounded by people who drain you, in dynamics that extinguish you, in environments that diminish you. Asking for love means ceasing to justify the unjustifiable. It means ceasing to gloss over everything so as not to hurt others' susceptibilities, while you erase yourself in the process. When you ask yourself for love, you are reclaiming your place. You are saying, I will no longer mistreat myself with thoughts that shred me. I will no longer abandon myself to please. I will no longer remain where I lose myself. Asking yourself for love means returning to yourself. It means learning to give yourself what you always hoped others would give you. But no matter how much you begged, never came in the way you dreamed. And that's okay. Not everyone knows how, but you can. Even if they never taught you how. Even if at first it felt ridiculous. Even if a part of you still believes you don't deserve it. And finally, there is direction. That internal compass that many lose. Not because they lack goals, but because they are overwhelmed by noise. Because they repeat someone else's path. Because they live borrowed lives. Asking yourself for direction means sitting in silence and asking with brutal honesty, what am I doing with my time? What sense does this routine have? Where do I want to go with all of this? And it's not about having a master plan or mapping out every detail perfectly. It's about staying awake. It's about not letting your autopilot run. It's about not surrendering yourself to the chaos of routine as if you were a puppet without a voice. Asking yourself for direction does not always provide immediate answers. Sometimes, the only thing you get is an uncomfortableness that tells you you cannot continue as you are. And that itself is something. That uncomfortableness is a message. A message that tells you you owe yourself movement, you owe yourself clarity, you owe yourself decisions. Not perfect ones, but your own. Not approved by everyone, but faithful to you. Because if you do not lead yourself, someone else will, and they might not take you where you truly want to go. You must learn to speak to yourself, to not disguise self-abandonment as tolerance or patience, to no longer wait for the world to save you from yourself. Because nobody comes. Nobody will live this life for you. Nobody will put order inside you if you don't. Nobody will write your story in your place. And as long as you wait for motivation to magically appear, you will remain anchored to the inertia that frustrates you the most. Asking yourself for discipline means stopping to act as if your energy were infinite. Asking yourself for love means recognizing that you cannot give what you do not give yourself. Asking yourself for direction means having the emotional maturity to change course if what you're doing no longer makes sense. And none of that happens in a single day. It is daily work, sometimes clumsy, sometimes uncomfortable, but profoundly transformative. You owe it to yourself. Yes, in capital letters. Because you've spent too much time looking outward, crying out for something that isn't going to work if it doesn't start within. You can have the best strategy, the best environment, the best advice. But if you don't ask yourself, with true intent, for what you need, if you don't make the effort to sustain yourself, to care for yourself, to guide yourself, everything else falls apart. And there is nothing more powerful than someone who has learned to be their own refuge, their own structure, their own engine. Not to isolate themselves, not to close off, but to build from there, from a solid center, from a place where what you give to others is not a desperate need to be loved, but a free, full, conscious choice. Asking yourself for what you need is not selfishness. It is a form of emotional maturity. And if you're reading this, it's because you are already at that point. Deep down, you already know what you have to ask yourself. You just need to stop waiting for someone else to do it for you. And do it. Because you can. Because you must. Because it's high time. Chapter 19. What you ask for and what you build. Let them match. It's not enough to wish. It's not enough to visualize. It's not enough to repeat pretty phrases each morning if what you build with your actions contradicts everything you claim to long for. You ask for clarity, but you fuel chaos with impulsive decisions. You ask for freedom, but you cling to what binds you. You ask for abundance, but you never organize your finances. You ask for healthy relationships, but you return to the same place every time you feel lonely. There is a silent incoherence that often goes unnoticed, but it sabotages every attempt to move forward. And it's not that you aren't capable. It's that you are out of alignment. What you ask for must be reflected in what you do, what you choose, and what you prioritize. Because if not, you are sending a broken message to the world, one that cannot stand, one that divides you internally. Because nothing is more draining than maintaining a version of yourself that says one thing while your day-to-day shouts something entirely different. When there is coherence between what you ask for and what you build, everything becomes lighter. Not because the path is easy, but because at least you know you are heading in the right direction. You are at peace with yourself. You are taking yourself seriously. You are no longer using dreams as an excuse to escape reality. Instead, you use them as a blueprint to design it. But that requires courage, because coherence makes you uncomfortable. It forces you to ask yourself questions you'd rather avoid. Do I truly want what I say I want? Or do I only repeat it because it sounds good? Am I willing to pay the price for what I desire? Or do I expect someone else to pay it for me? Am I building, day by day, something that resembles, however slightly, what I imagine? If the answer is no, it's not about demanding more loudly. It's about reviewing what you're doing with what you already have. Because the universe, life, God, reality, call it what you will, does not respond to empty speeches. It responds to movement, to focus, to repetition, to directed effort. You can say 1,000 times you want emotional stability, but if you don't do therapy, if you don't examine your wounds, if you don't learn to communicate what you feel, all you are doing is constructing more confusion. You can ask for success, but if you don't study your field, if you don't protect your reputation, if you don't deliver value in what you do, success becomes a mirage that frustrates you even more. And the worst part is not failing to achieve it. The worst part is believing you are doing everything you can when, in reality, you are leaving gaps everywhere. Decisions you don't make, habits you don't sustain, doors you don't close, dreams you idealize yet do not honor in practice. Because honoring a dream is not just wishing for it, it is living up to it. It is acting as if it were already real, even if it's not. It is devoting yourself to what no one else is going to hold you accountable for, but you know is essential. It's easy to ask. The hard part is sustaining the process. The hard part is building with intention, knowing that each small action either brings you closer or pulls you farther away. There are no neutral details. Everything you do either contributes toward or detracts from your goal. You cannot ask for deep relationships if you only give superficial attention. You cannot ask for respect if you fail yourself over and over. You cannot ask for results without accepting that there will be days you don't feel like doing anything, and still you show up. That is building. And only when you build with honesty can you look at what you have raised and say, I asked for this, and I made it happen. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This is consequence, of focus, of discipline, of coherence. It does not mean everything will turn out well, but it does mean you will be able to look in the mirror without that uncomfortable sense of self-deception. Because when you ask for grand things but live small, that discomfort takes root. Even if you smile, even if you repeat that nothing's wrong, you know something is off. You know there is a dissonance within you crying out for alignment. So pay attention. It's not enough to keep dreaming, nor to fill notebooks with intentions, nor to chant mantras with no soul. What's important is whether you're coherent, whether what you build, day after day, resembles, at least a bit, what you've been asking for. And if it doesn't, don't beat yourself up, but do take responsibility, because no one else can make that adjustment for you. Only you can realize that it's not about dreaming harder, but about living as if you were already the person capable of making those dreams real. The distance between what you ask for and what you have is not just a matter of time. It's a matter of decisions. How many times a day do you choose to act with intention, even when you don't feel like it? How many times do you stay firm, even when no one is watching? How many times do you build something that sustains what you've asked for? And therein lies the power. Realizing that it's not about renouncing asking. It's about making sure every step, every choice, every habit aligns with it. Because asking without building is like planting seeds without watering them. And no matter how fertile the soil, nothing grows without care. If today you feel you've asked for much and received little, don't blame yourself. But ask yourself plainly, have I built enough to sustain what I ask for? Because maybe it's not that you don't deserve it. It's that you're not yet ready to sustain it. And that too is part of the process. Maturing to receive. Growing to sustain. Rising to the level of your own desires. So yes, ask. Ask out loud. Ask with your heart. But build with your feet on the ground. Because only then will what you long for and what you do cease to be in conflict. And there, in that silent coherence, a different life begins. A life that is no longer chased. It is embodied. It is sustained. It is honored. Chapter 20. The true power of knowing how to ask. Knowing how to ask is not just a useful skill for life. It is a profoundly human act, and at the same time profoundly transformative. It is a declaration of identity. When you know how to ask, you're not only saying what you need, you're saying who you are, what you believe you deserve, how far you allow yourself to go, what you're willing to sustain, and what you will no longer accept. Because asking, truly with awareness, clarity, and presence, is not something you do only with your mouth. It is done with a straight back, a clear gaze, and a history behind it. It is done from a place where you are no longer begging for permission to exist. It is done from the maturity of someone who has learned to inhabit themselves and not apologize any longer for doing so. For years, many of us were taught that asking was a sign of weakness, that the correct thing to do was to endure, to remain silent, to resign ourselves, that if you were strong, you proved it by swallowing everything, that if you were good, you accepted the bare minimum, that if you were grateful, you never raised your voice. And that's why there are so many broken people who don't look broken, because they smile, because they function, because they don't complain. But inside, they are hollow. And the worst part is, they believe that's how it must be. That asking for something more, something different, something fairer, would make them appear selfish or ungrateful. And that is where the true power of knowing how to ask begins to reveal itself. Because asking does not make you weak. It makes you aware. It makes you present in your own life. It forces you to stop acting as if everything were the same, as if your voice didn't matter, as if your needs were an inconvenience rather than a compass. The power of asking is that it sets boundaries. Because when you know how to ask, you also know how far you can go. You no longer let yourself be swept along by the inertia of, well, that's just how things are. You no longer accept silences as answers. You no longer settle for the minimum out of fear of appearing demanding. You no longer negotiate with yourself out of fear of inconveniencing others. But there's more. The power of asking also means that you no longer do it from a wound. You do it from choice. You no longer go through life seeking someone to fix you. You go whole. You go knowing who you are. You go knowing that if something doesn't come, it's not because you lack worth, but simply because it wasn't meant for you. And that, above all, changes everything. Because then you ask without crawling. You ask without losing yourself. You ask knowing you can keep walking, whether or not you get what you requested. That is the kind of power that unsettles. It does not shout, yet it is heard. It does not threaten, yet it commands. It does not manipulate, yet it impacts. Because it is power that comes from someone who has stopped asking for permission to exist. From someone who no longer expects approval. From someone who has understood that asking is not a sign of lack, but a sign of life. And yes, it sometimes costs. Because asking also means exposing yourself, opening up, risking that you will hear a no. And no one likes having the door closed in their face. But what almost no one says is that each time you don't ask because you fear rejection, you are shutting the door on yourself. Each time you postpone that conversation, each time you swallow that discomfort, each time you pretend everything is fine when it is not, you are silently telling yourself that you don't matter that much. And that weighs. And that weight, over time, turns into resignation, apathy, silent pain. That is why knowing how to ask is not just a matter of strategy. It is a commitment to yourself, to your truth, to your history, to your boundaries, to your deepest longings, to what you may not yet know how to name, but you know you can no longer ignore. And it's not about turning into someone who demands all the time. No, it's about becoming someone who no longer hides the important things, who no longer masks their discomfort to maintain peace, who no longer settles for what they are given if it does not build them up, nourish them, or elevate them. Because asking, done well, changes your relationships. It changes how you work. It changes how you love. It changes how you live. It gives you an axis. It gives you a center. It reminds you that your life also involves you, that not everything happening around you dictates how you feel, that you too have the right to intervene, to say, to choose. And if someone cannot handle that, if they bristle when you ask with respect and clarity, That too is information. Not about you, but about the kind of relationship that person was willing to have with you. Because asking, however subtle it may be, also reveals intentions. It exposes dynamics. It uncloaks truths. That is where you discover who was by your side out of habit and who was there by choice. Who rejoices when you value yourself and who recoils when you stop conceding. Who adapts to your growth and who only knew how to be with you when you were smaller, more manageable, more compliant. And although that hurts, it releases you because it clears illusions. It returns you to yourself. It gives you the opportunity to surround yourself with people who do know how to build from clarity, from reciprocity, from real respect, not the kind that's feigned. That is the true power of knowing how to ask. It's not that you get everything you want. It's that even if you don't, you no longer betray yourself. You no longer remain silent. You no longer hide. You no longer pretend to be fine in places that wither you. And just for that, you have already won. Asking is a way of making yourself visible, of saying, I am here, of refusing to dissolve into the expectations of others, of refusing to become the functional character that everyone applauds while you fade away inside. Because yes, you can go on not asking. You can continue being polite, discreet, silent. But at what cost? This final chapter does not seek to have you rage-demanding the world with years of accumulated resentment. It seeks to have you begin at the hardest place, listening to yourself, daring to name what you truly want, no longer justifying your desires, facing your fears head-on, and undertaking the risk of living authentically. Because when you know how to ask, with a steady voice but an open heart, you choose not only what you want, but also who you want to be. And that choice, although it hurts, although it unsettles, although it may initially leave you feeling alone, opens the right doors. Not always the quickest ones, but the most honest ones. And in the end, that is what life is about. Learning to be at peace with yourself, to feel that your voice matters, to know that what you build, what you give, and what you receive makes sense. And for that to happen, you must ask. With truth on your lips, with your feet firmly on the ground, and with your dignity intact. That is power. Not the power of one who asks because they need, but the power of one who asks because they honor themselves, because they respect themselves, because they have understood that their story deserves to be told, heard, and lived out loud. Thank you for journeying here. If this audiobook stirred something within you, if at any point you felt as though I was speaking directly to you, it was meant to be that way. You are not alone on this path of awakening and rebuilding. Leave me a comment. I want to read you. Tell me which part touched you most. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel to keep receiving content that shakes you, that inspires you, and that reminds you who you are. See you in the next audiobook.